ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਇਲੈਕਸ਼ਨਸ 2021 ਤੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ ਇਲੈਕਸ਼ਨ ਡਨ ਸ਼ੇਰ-ਏ-ਪੰਜਾਬ ਰੇਡੀਓ ਤੇ।
ਸਵਾਲ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ,
ਸ਼ਬਦ ਸਾਡੇ,
ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਕਹਾਣੀ
ਸਾਡੀ ਜ਼ੁਬਾਨੀ,
ਤਰਕ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ, ਜਜ਼ਬਾਤ ਦੀ ਕਦਰ, ਹਰ ਘਟਨਾ, ਹਰ ਵਿਸ਼ੇ ਤੇ। ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ ਜੀ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸਭ ਦਾ। ਸੁਣ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ ਸ਼ੇਰ-ਏ-ਪੰਜਾਬ ਰੇਡੀਓ 600 AM ਪੌਲ ਬਰਾਡ ਸ਼ੋ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਇਲੈਕਸ਼ਨ ਡੈਨ। ਇਲੈਕਸ਼ਨ ਡੈਨ ਦੇ ਅਖੀਰਲੇ ਮਹਿਮਾਨ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜ ਚੁੱਕੇ ਨੇ ਜੀ। ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਮਨਦੀਪ ਰੰਧਾਵਾ ਜੀ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਪੇਸ਼ ਕਰਨਗੇ। ਬੜਾ ਲੰਬਾ ਦਿਨ ਰਿਹਾ ਸਾਡੇ ਲਈ। ਸਵੇਰ 7 ਵਜੇ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਰਾਤ ਦੇ 8 ਵਜੇ ਤੱਕ ਵੱਖ-ਵੱਖ ਪਾਰਟੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਅਲੱਗ-ਅਲੱਗ ਨੁਮਾਇੰਦਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਬੁਲਾਇਆ ਗਿਆ। ਆਪਦੇ ਖਿਆਲ, ਆਪਦੀ ਪਾਰਟੀਆਂ ਦੇ ਪਲੇਟਫਾਰਮ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਂਝੇ ਕੀਤੇ ਨੇ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆਪਣਾ ਮਨ ਬਣਾ ਸਕੋ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਜਲਦਬਾਜ਼ੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਰਾਈਆਂ ਜਾ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਚੋਣਾਂ ਨੇ, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿਸ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਤਾਉਣਾ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ ਸਥਾਈ ਸਟੇਬਲ ਗਵਰਨਮੈਂਟ ਮਿਲ ਸਕੇ। ਹੁਣ ਇਸ ਸੈਗਮੈਂਟ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੇਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੌਨ ਐਲਡੈਗ, ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ ਕਲੋਵਰਡੇਲ ਲੈਂਗਲੀ ਤੋਂ ਲਿਬਰਲ ਪਾਰਟੀ ਦੇ ਕੈਂਡੀਡੇਟ ਨੇ, ਆਪਣੇ ਵਿਚਾਰ ਸਾਂਝੇ ਕਰਨਗੇ। ਕੁਝ ਸਾਡੇ ਸਵਾਲ ਹੋਣਗੇ ਔਰ ਜਵਾਬ ਮਿਸਟਰ ਐਲਡੈਗ ਦੇ ਹੋਣਗੇ। ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ। Welcome to Sher-E-Punjab Radio, Mr. Eldag. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Did I say your last name correctly? Eldag or Eldog?
Aldag works. Aldag works.
Aldag.
Yeah.
That's good. Brief introduction about you so my listeners would know. People living in Cloverdale, who are they going to be voting if they want to vote Liberals?
Yeah, so it's John Aldag, and do I have a minute to introduce myself?
Yeah, go ahead. That's what we're doing now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, absolutely. So I had worked for the National Park Service for 34 years prior to entering politics. So environment and climate change are very important to me. But I was also very concerned about the direction Canada was headed on issues such as immigration, on science and evidence-based decision-making, and that's how I got into politics. I represented Cloverdale Langley City as the Liberal Member of Parliament from 2015 to 2019. I lost very narrowly in 2019 to the Conservatives, and I have a fantastic team. We're out having great conversations on the doorsteps, and we're determined to win the seat back and represent Ottawa, Cloverdale Langley City once again in Ottawa.
You started off, I would say Liberal Party started off with a good percentage of support. But looks like the support did not go up. It did go down a bit, but it's still standing at about 30%, 32%. What do you think could be the reasons? Are you not being able to capture more support?
I think there are questions about the timing, is one of the things we're hearing on the doorsteps. And to that, what I've responded is that there really are two factors at play here. One of them is that when I campaigned and when our government campaigned in 2019, the issues are very different that we're seeing today. We did not anticipate, as nobody anticipated, a global pandemic. And so we had talked about things about how to make families better, how to support businesses, and then the pandemic hit, and our government had to invest billions and billions of dollars to help families and businesses survive. We felt that it was better for the government to make these investments instead of having people take out loans or lines of credit at higher interest rates, or businesses going bankrupt and laying off their employees. And so we've invested in a pandemic recovery. And as we go through this fourth wave, we think that we have a plan to get us back to normal. But I think that a lot of people are just unsure about the timing of the election. It is 2 years early in the election cycle. And so I think that that's given people some pause, some time to reflect on who they're going to be supporting, and that reflects in the polls.
If we talk about the Conservative Party, they're calling it unnecessary and unwanted elections. I mean, you could have gone on for a few more months. You had full support of all the parties.
Well, you know what, talking to my colleagues who were there, I would say that they would say that that was not the case. I would say in the first year of Parliament, we had great cross-party support to roll out pandemic supports and things like that. But in the last 6 months, we've seen great stalling. We've seen the opposition parties, the Conservatives in particular, voting against and holding up the work that needs to be done to keep Canadians to help them recover from this pandemic. And so I think that we lost the cooperation that we saw in the early days of the pandemic, and that's the other reason I think that we're at this stage in the election, or that we had to go to an election. So really we're asking the voters to choose a party that is going to give the best vision to come out of the pandemic and to help us get it back to our lives, whatever that looks like. And I think that we have a choice about, do we want to do exactly the same thing we were doing before or something different?
Okay, now you did represent for 4 years. You did represent Cloverdale Langley. What are the new issues? What do you think is the most concerning issues for the residents of Cloverdale Langley?
You know, the top one that we're hearing right now is affordability, and that's been on the news a bit today. Housing prices continue to go up, price of food, price of gas, but wages don't go up. And so this is something that I think is very front of mind. Our government has a great plan on housing. If anybody is not owning a house and wants to get into the home market, particularly if somebody is under the 40 years of age, we have a really strong program to help renters and first-time home buyers. So that's we're hearing a lot about that, and so we look at our platform on johnaldeg.ca. There's lots of information about how we'll deal with affordability issues. The second thing that I often heard about on the doors was transit and the lack of transit south of the Fraser. Well, your listeners and viewers might know that we've committed $1.3 billion to get SkyTrain from King George Station to Langley City down the Fraser Highway corridor. And that's going to be absolutely transformative for our community and everyone down the Fraser Highway. So I'm hearing less about transit this year, but that's being replaced by climate change. I think that people, after the summer we had, the droughts, the fires, the smoke, the longest or second longest period without rain in the Lower Mainland in recorded history, people are thinking that this is a problem and we need to deal with it. And so I'm really pleased to say that the Liberals have a well-documented, well-supported plan to address climate change. People like Andrew Weaver, BC's former Green Party leader, has endorsed our plan. We also hear a lot about things like mental health support, the opioid crises, homelessness, addictions, and so that sort of suite of social issues are also weighing on the minds of Canadians. We've come through a tough year, but a lot of people have said, you know what, we still have people that need help. And so, we have a plan for increasing medical services, more doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners, more mental health support, more housing, 1.4 million new housing units over the next 10 years. And so these are all things I think are going to be very important to the residents and constituents of Cloverdale Langley City.
Talking about affordability, there's another major issue that came up was flipping houses, buying, fixing them up, and selling for more price. And one of your own Liberal Party candidates from Granville, Mr. Noor Mohammed, he has been accused by several news media and outlets that he had flipped so far in 9 or 10 years, 21 houses. Now, what is your game plan to stop house flipping or even make housing more affordable?
Right. So the issue is that house flipping, it was something that a lot of people were doing as an investment strategy. There was nothing illegal about it, and so people did it over time, including, as you say, my running mates in Vancouver Granville. What we're saying though is that kind of action can lead to increased costs of housing, and so we're saying we want it to stop. And so we have a plan to make sure that people, when they buy a house, that they hold it for at least 1 year. And if they sell it before then for speculative purposes, then there will be taxes that apply to it. And that's a way of encouraging people to not do that, so that we're not adding to the squeeze on the supply of housing. And so that's one way of addressing the increased housing prices. If people are going to do it as an investment, they will be able to deduct the expenses that they put into those house improvements, so that will help offset some of those costs. But also, people's lives change, and so if I had the question on the doors the other day, a woman said, well, what if we buy a house and my husband transfers to Toronto 6 months later? Will we have to pay this tax? Well, the answer is no. There will be a mechanism so that if a marriage breaks down, a transfer happens, a baby's born, and you need to upsize your house, a parent maybe passes away and the surviving parent wants to move in with you, those will all be allowed. So this is very much addressing the speculative housing market. And if people want to do that, it won't be completely prevented, but it will be taxed. And,
from the profile here, Mr. Aldag, you had presented a member's bill C-374, which, if adopted, would provide a seat in the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis representation. Very good bill. But just before you, we had an NDP candidate. Thank you, sir. Before you, an NDP candidate came in and he said the Liberal government, Justin Trudeau, isn't doing enough for indigenous people, especially indigenous people living in northern reserves. There isn't supply of fresh water. They're living in substandard housing, and he kind of accused the Liberal government for not providing enough funds for these two major issues: clean and pure water.
Yeah.
At the same time, the
Yeah, I think that that's a really unfair statement for the NDP to do. The Liberal government has committed or spent $3.5 billion to make sure that every First Nations community has clean drinking water. That's more of the money on this issue than any level of government has ever spent. When we formed government in 2015, I believe there were over almost 160 boil water advisories. And since then, we removed, I believe, just over 100. The 50 that are remaining are well underway. I think that there's only two that have run into some problems. Will take a bit longer, but the vast majority of them should be off sometime this year, and that's good news for First Nations communities. I will also say that we lost a bit of time because of the pandemic. Many of these communities are remote, and they were concerned about COVID being brought into the communities. A lot of the expertise to build these treatment plants came from the south, from other communities. And so they said, you know what, we don't want anybody coming in here right now. And so there was a delay, but we are committed to getting this. There was just a couple of days ago, I think 8 boil water advisories were taken off. And some of these have been in place for many years, which is just not acceptable. So we are committed and actually
that's
delivering on that one. I was
that's
going to
good.
say on
Now,
the
at the same
housing,
time, there's a yeah. Go ahead.
on housing, we have a specific Indigenous housing strategy as well as part of our national housing plan. And you're right, a lot of the on-reserve housing is inadequate because governments haven't invested, and we're saying that also is not acceptable. And so we are going to invest in that housing. And we are working very closely with First Nations communities, and we'll continue to work with Indigenous communities across Canada, First Nations, Inuits, and Métis, to make sure that they have the same rights and access to things like water and housing that every other Canadian has.
Now, a lot of female MPs quit and they are not running again. Miss Jody Wilson-Raybould being one of them, Miss Philpott being another one, and Miss Caesar. She's got a hyphenated last name. I'm not can't remember
Yeah.
the full name, but it has a initial or last name Caesar. At the same time, another Indigenous MP blaming that Parliament has a very toxic atmosphere. You haven't been in the Parliament for the last 2 years, but knowing your own leader who you worked with, you were in Ottawa for 4 years previously. Uh, can you shed some light on it? Is the atmosphere
Absolutely.
that bad? I mean, yes, we heard General uh, Payette. At that time, she was alleged to have toxic atmosphere in her office. Now, it's the prime minister.
Yeah, I can't speak to the experiences that Selena and Jody and Jane had. I know that one of the things that attracted me to the Liberal Party and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is their commitment to equal access to and equal participation by women in society, including in politics. And so, I think the Prime Minister has been very supportive. I know in caucus discussions and other things we've said and done, the actions of the government. We have supported a feminist agenda, and we had a gender balanced cabinet. Some of the cabinet ministers were brand new. It's happened, men and women, and I think there were some learning lessons along the way. But I think the Prime Minister has been very supportive of his cabinet ministers and his caucus. So like I said, I don't know what the short end of it was. But we talked a lot about this in the 2019-2019 campaign, and I know that the constituents I'm talking to are saying, let's move on, let's focus on things that are important to our community and our country. Let's get through this pandemic. Let's get the economy going. Let's get people back in their jobs. And so those are the issues that we're talking
Mhm.
about.
Now, the riding you're running from, there was a very slight margin that Conservatives won. I think it was less than 100 or less than 200. Most recent demonstrations, most recent protests, most recent, throwing gravel obscenities at your leader. Are those protests helping your party, or you think that will be it will have a negative effect when it comes to voting for you?
I think that some of that anger that we're seeing, the protests, the gravel throwing, are coming. I think it's results of the vaccination and anti-mask community who are lashing out. I think that our prime minister has been very clear. 85%, or about 85% of Canadians have done their part. The best way we can get over this pandemic is to have vaccines and to have a mask mandate as imposed by the provinces. But we're encouraging people to follow that. And if we want to get our lives back, if we want to get business back, then the best way for people is to comply with these public health orders that the provinces impose. And so when we see these types of protests, I think that there are people that are angry about it, but it does actually point to the 85% of people who have done their part, that we are taking action, we're standing with them, and we're actually trying to increase the freedoms that they have so that they can go to some non-essential services without having to fear the risk of being infected by those who are unvaccinated and unmasked. I also would say that we've seen recently protests in front of hospitals, and to me, I just think that is absolutely unacceptable. There are stories of people needing cancer treatments who were blocked, or a woman in labor had to be escorted through the lines as she was in labor. And so our party has announced that if we form government, we will take action and we'll introduce legislation to make it illegal to protest in front of and to block access to.
Before we run out of time, sir.
Yes.
Before we run out of time, let's talk about softwood lumber. Lumber prices went up, then they came down, crashing down. There is no, what they say is there is no jurisdiction controlling this. In the summer months, when people wanted to buy houses, the lumber prices went up. Now they've come down, they crashed down dramatically. Does the
Right.
Liberal Party have a plan, or will they have a plan in effect to control or even save our lumber industry?
Well, we're a country of trade, and so there are agreements such as the softwood lumber agreement that we have with the Americans as one example. We've run into problems when I was in office. The Americans were imposing tariffs, which were throwing the whole industry off. We've won these cases in the tribunals that govern this, and then the Americans appeal, and it takes forever. Canada has withstood the test. That what we're doing, the pricing that we have for our lumber is reasonable. I actually haven't followed it over the last 2 years because I've been out of office, and I don't know exactly where we're at with the tariffs that the Americans were imposing or not imposing. I believe that there were supply issues, there were labor issues, there were all sorts of things through the pandemic. But yeah, we absolutely stand with the softwood and the overall lumber industry. These are good jobs. They're important to our economy. They're especially important to British Columbia's economy. I have constituents who have sawmills within Cloverdale, Langley City, and I've talked to them, and they employ. They have good jobs. They employ a lot of people. And so we want to make sure that those jobs continue and that sector continues to do well.
Time at the end, 2 minutes. If you have a message to convey to our listeners, please go ahead in closing.
Sure, perfect. So I would say to your listeners, first of all, thank you for joining us, and thank you for having me on this evening. This is, I think, like every election, it's an important one. This is really about choosing the way that we want to go forward. We saw seniors who died in nursing homes in the first wave of the pandemic, and I don't think that's the kind of future we want to go back to. And, we have parties such as the Conservatives saying that they will revisit and probably return assault weapons to the streets of our communities, which will not make our communities safe. I believe that everybody should have a look at the platforms of each of the parties, and I believe that the Liberal Party is the strongest one to guide us for the next 4 years as we continue to move through challenging economic times. I also think, though, that we can't underestimate the role of the individual members of Parliament, and I have a very strong record. My voting record is public. It's on my website, and I work for a very inclusive community. I held consultations on difficult issues, making sure that I was not living in just my echo chamber, that I was hearing conflicting and competing interests, because I think that that's the role of a representative. The Conservative candidate who took a very different approach. She's an extreme social conservative who ran on bringing a biblical perspective to civil society. And I think that that's really concerning when we have a very diverse community within Cloverdale Langley City. And so the things she has championed, she fought medical assistance in dying, she fought a woman's right to choose, she doesn't believe climate change is real. And I think that that does a disservice to our community. And so I would ask your listeners to look at the Conservative candidate and her record. I would ask them to look at my record. I've been received a shout of support from Elizabeth May for the work that I did on the environment, and including chairing the Environment and Sustainable Development Committee. I've had my 2 years away from Parliament, and I had time at home sitting on the couch, as many did during the COVID pandemic. I am rested up. I'm ready to go. I understand the issues, and we'll continue to have discussions, hard discussions with the community about what we should be focusing on. And in order to be your voice, you're in Ottawa, and to get the supports that we need here in our community, I need your votes on September 20th. So everybody who is progressive and wants an inclusive representative, please get out there on September 20th and cast your ballot for John Aldag. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you, sir. Have a good night and all the best. Good luck. ਜੌਨ ਐਲਡੈਗ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜੇ ਹੋਏ ਸਨ। ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ। ਔਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਾਫੀ ਵਿਚਾਰਾਂ ਆਪਦੀਆਂ ਪੇਸ਼ ਕੀਤੀਆਂ ਨੇ, ਜਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਪਦੇ ਰੱਖੇ ਨੇ। ਵੈਸੇ ਪਾਰਟੀ ਪਲੈਟਫਾਰਮ ਬਾਰੇ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕੁਝ ਨਾ ਦੱਸ ਸਕੇ। ਸਵਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਪੁੱਛੇ ਗਏ ਸੀ ਅਫੋਰਡੇਬਿਲਿਟੀ ਬਾਰੇ, ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹੀ ਗੱਲਾਂ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਸ 'ਤੇ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। ਫਲਿੱਪਿੰਗ 'ਤੇ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਗਿਆ, ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਜੀ ਫਲਿੱਪਿੰਗ ਲਈ ਅਸੀਂ ਹੋਰ ਸਖਤ ਕਾਨੂੰਨ ਬਣਾਵਾਂਗੇ। ਲੰਬਰ ਬਾਰੇ ਪੁੱਛਿਆ ਗਿਆ ਜੀ, ਲੰਬਰ ਦੀਆਂ ਕੀਮਤਾਂ ਜਦੋਂ ਘਰ ਬਣਾਉਣ ਦਾ ਟਾਈਮ ਸੀ ਉਦੋਂ ਅਸਮਾਨੀ ਚੜ੍ਹ ਗਈਆਂ ਨੇ ਅਤੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕਦਮ ਹੀ ਹੇਠਾਂ ਡਿੱਗ ਪਈਆਂ। ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕੀ ਕਰੋਗੇ? ਸਾਫਟ ਲੰਬਰ ਬਾਰੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਹੀ ਬੜਾ ਕੁਝ ਚੱਲ ਰਿਹਾ। ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਜੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਪਹਿਚਾਣਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਮੁਸ਼ਕਿਲ ਹੈ, ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕੀਤੀ ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾਵੇਗੀ। ਹੁਣ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕੀ ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਤਾਂ ਉਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਦੱਸ ਕੇ ਗਏ, ਪਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਆਪਣੇ ਖਿਆਲਾਤ ਰੱਖੇ ਨੇ, ਸਾਰੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਸਾਹਮਣੇ ਹੈ। ਅੱਜ ਸਮਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਦਾ ਤਰਜਮਾ ਕਰਕੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੱਕ ਪਹੁੰਚਾਇਆ ਜਾਵੇ, ਪਰ ਆਗਾਮੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਡੇ ਕੋਲ ਰਿਕਾਰਡਡ ਸਾਰੀ ਇਨਫੋਰਮੇਸ਼ਨ ਪਈ ਹੈ, ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੱਕ ਪਹੁੰਚਾਵਾਂਗੇ। ਸੋ ਸਾਡੀ ਟੀਮ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਇਹ ਬੜਾ ਵਧੀਆ ਉਪਰਾਲਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਗਿਆ, ਜੋ ਸਵੇਰ 7 ਵਜੇ ਤੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਰਾਤ ਦੇ 8 ਵਜੇ ਤੱਕ ਹਰ ਅੱਧੇ ਘੰਟੇ ਵੱਖ-ਵੱਖ ਕੈਂਡੀਡੇਟਸ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੱਕ ਪਹੁੰਚਾਉਣ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਅੱਗੇ ਕੌਣ ਸਨ? ਇੱਕ ਇੱਕ ਨਾਮ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਦੇਵਾਂ। ਸੋਹਰਾਬ ਸੰਧੂ, ਰੋਮਨਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਸਹੋਤਾ, ਮਨਿੰਦਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਉੜੀਸਾ, ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਪੱਲਵੀ ਕਸ਼ਪ, ਗੁਰਵੀਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਘਰੇ ਚਲੇ ਗਏ ਨੇ, ਦੀਪਾਲੀ ਸ਼ਰਮਾ, ਦੀਪਾਲੀ ਰਾਣੀ, ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਅਸੀਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਔਰ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਦੇਖੋ ਜੀ, ਅਸੀਂ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਤਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ, ਪਰ ਕੁੜੀਆਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੀਆਂ ਕਿ ਦੱਸੋ, ਹੁਣ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਭੁੱਲ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ? ਯੂ ਥਿੰਕ ਆਈ ਫੋਰਗਾਟ? ਨਹੀਂ, ਸਾਡੇ ਮੈਨੇਜਰ ਨਿੰਮੀ ਡੌਲਾ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦਾ ਸਾਰਾ ਉਪਰਾਲਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਗਿਆ। ਸੋ ਬਿਗ ਹੈਂਡ ਟੂ ਹਰ, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੇ ਹੂ ਪੁੱਟ ਦਿਸ ਹੋਲ ਪਲਾਨ ਟੂਗੈਦਰ। ਅਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਜੀ ਕਾਫੀ ਇੰਜੋਏ ਕੀਤਾ, ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੋਈ ਸ਼ੱਕ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸਣਾ ਹੁਣ ਇਸ ਫੇਸਬੁੱਕ ਦੇ ਜ਼ਰੀਏ, ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਕਈ ਦਿਨਾਂ ਤੱਕ ਚੱਲਦੀ ਰਹੇਗੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਲਾਈਵ ਸਟਰੀਮ ਅਸੀਂ ਪਾ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, ਕਿ ਹਾਊ ਡਿਡ ਯੂ ਲਾਈਕ ਇਟ? ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਾਡੇ ਮੈਨੇਜਰ ਨਿੰਮੀ ਡੌਲਾ ਹੋਰਾਂ ਨੇ ਬੜੀ ਮਿਹਨਤ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ, ਜਿਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਫਟਾਫਟ ਫਰਨੀਚਰ ਲਿਆਂਦਾ ਗਿਆ, ਫਟਾਫਟ ਫੋਨ ਆਏ ਨੇ, ਉਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਜੀ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਲਾਈਟਿੰਗ ਨੂੰ ਕਵਰ ਕਰਨ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਉਹ ਲਿਆਂਦਾ ਜਾਵੇ, ਔਰ ਮਿੰਟਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਦਾ ਇੰਤਜ਼ਾਮ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ। ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਡੀ ਗੱਲ, ਗਰਮਾ ਗਰਮ ਭਟੂਰੇ ਹਰ ਘੰਟੇ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਕਿ ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਸਾਡਾ ਸਟਾਫ ਦਾ ਮੈਂਬਰ ਕਦੇ ਐਨਰਜੀ ਲੋ ਨਾ ਕਰੇ। ਟਾਈਮ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਜੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ, ਨਹੀਂ ਤਾਂ ਅਜੇ ਮੈਂ ਪੂੜੀਆਂ ਵਾਲੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨੀ ਸੀ, ਡੋਨਟਸ ਬਾਰੇ। ਪਰ ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ, ਹੈਵ ਅ ਗੁੱਡ ਨਾਈਟ ਐਵਰੀਬਾਡੀ।